Welcome back to our channel. Think your 1970, 1983, 1989, or 2003 dime is just 10 cents. Think again. Rare ones from these years can be worth hundreds. Hit like and subscribe to see if you have one. In 1970, the United States Mint continued its long tradition of producing dimes as part of everyday American commerce. At the time, the dime was already a well-established denomination, having undergone decades of design evolution. The Roosevelt dime design, introduced in 1946 to honor President Franklin D. Roosevelt after his passing, had become the familiar face of the 10-cent piece. Struck in copper-nickel clad after the nation moved away from silver coinage in 1965, the dime of the early 1970s was considered a workhorse coin, small, precise, and rarely in the spotlight. The San Francisco Mint, with its distinctive S mint mark, was responsible for many of the proof issues for collectors during this era, while the Philadelphia and Denver mints focused on circulation strikes. But in that particular year, tucked within the ordinary hum of mint presses and the rhythmic clink of coins cascading into bins, something unusual happened, something that would escape detection for years. The creation of a coin is meant to be a controlled process. Blanks, known as planchets, are carefully prepared, polished, and fed into presses. Dies are examined for defects, and alignment is double-checked to avoid striking errors. Yet no matter how many safeguards exist, human oversight and the sheer volume of production leave room for mistakes. In 1970, amid this environment of precision and routine, a handful of dimes emerged that carried with them a subtle but extraordinary anomaly. It was the sort of imperfection that might go unnoticed by thousands of people passing change across counters or slipping coins into their pockets. And indeed, for a while, that is exactly what happened. Years later, a collector, someone who had spent countless hours poring over coins under a magnifying glass, would unknowingly stumble upon one of these dimes. The discovery did not happen in a coin shop or an auction hall, but rather in a small, unassuming box of loose change saved over the years. This collector had the habit of setting aside anything that looked different, though often the differences amounted to nothing more than a bit of toning or surface wear. But on one quiet afternoon, as they tipped the contents of the box onto the table and began to sort, one dime caught the light in an odd way. It was not the luster that drew attention first, but something about the details, an almost imperceptible strangeness in the date and design alignment. At first, it was simply a curiosity. The collector rotated the coin between thumb and forefinger, letting the light skim its surface, searching for signs of unusual wear or a minting defect. The numbers in the date seemed perfectly normal at a glance, yet there was a faint doubling along the edges of the numerals, subtle enough that someone without experience might dismiss it as damage. The lettering around the rim appeared just a hair misaligned. These small hints set the mind racing. Could it be a case of machine doubling? Or was it something more elusive and rare? The heart began to beat faster, that familiar mix of skepticism and hope that coin enthusiasts know all too well. Determined to understand, the collector reached for a magnifier. Under closer inspection, the truth began to reveal itself, piece by piece. The doubling was not random or haphazard. It had the telltale crispness of a true hub doubling, a doubling created during the die-making process rather than in the striking of the coin itself. Such errors were rare, and in the early 1970s, not all were well documented. But what made this coin even more intriguing was that the underlying features didn't seem to belong entirely to the 1970 design. There was something ghostly, almost hidden beneath the surface. The faint traces of another year. It was as if the coin carried the shadow of a past life, a remnant from a different time. As it turned out, the 1970s proof dimes with this particular anomaly had been struck over coins from another country, specifically a Canadian dime of an earlier date. This overstriking process was never intentional. It was the result of a planchet from a foreign coin somehow entering the minting process. The Canadian features were mostly obliterated by the new strike, but on certain specimens, fragments of the original date and design could still be seen under magnification. It was an error so unusual that even seasoned collectors found themselves pausing, marveling at how it could have slipped past quality control entirely. For the collector who held this coin in hand, the realization felt electric. The imagination leapt to the scene at the San Francisco Mint, picturing a foreign planchet nestled among American ones, fed into the press without notice. The dies came down, stamping Roosevelt's portrait over the faint, lingering image of another nation's coinage. It was the kind of minting mishap that, once recognized, transformed an everyday object into a numismatic treasure that in the months that followed, the collector began to research obsessively. The trail led through old auction catalogs, dusty price guides, and obscure coin club newsletters. Mentions of the 1970s overstruck dime were sparse, but each reference confirmed its rarity. Early sales of such coins in the 1980s and 1990s were modest by today's standards, fetching a few $100s among specialized collectors. But as awareness of the era grew, so did demand. By the turn of the millennium, examples in pristine proof condition began to surface in major auctions, and the prices told a clear story. The market had begun to understand the significance. The physical characteristics of the era made it particularly fascinating. Under the smooth, mirror-like fields of the proof strike, one could detect the faint outline of the original coin's date, just enough to intrigue but not enough to distract from Roosevelt's profile. In some specimens, parts of the Canadian design elements peeked out from behind the torch and olive branch on the reverse, subtle and almost defiant reminders of the coin's unusual journey. It was as if two histories had collided in a single piece of metal, fused together by the force of the minting press. The impact on the coin's rarity was undeniable. Regular 1970s proof dimes were plentiful, and most collectors could acquire one without difficulty. But this error, with its unique backstory and distinctive markings, occupied a completely different category. It was not merely a curiosity. It was a conversation piece, a tangible mystery, and a glimpse into the unpredictable side of minting. The more collectors learned, the more they valued its place in a collection, not just for its market price, but for the story it told. And yet, the twist lay not only in the overstriking itself but in the fact that for years, the coin's true nature could remain hidden in plain sight. Without magnification and knowledge, one could pass it over as just another shiny dime. The idea that such a remarkable piece of minting history could be rattling around in pocket change or resting unnoticed in a collection was part of its allure. It became a reminder that treasures can exist in the most ordinary of places, waiting for someone with the right eye to recognize them. The collector who first noticed this example would later admit, the discovery was as much about patience as it was about luck. The hours spent examining coins, the willingness to pause and look closer at something that didn't quite fit, all of it had led to this moment. And in holding that dime, feeling its slight weight in the palm, there was a deep awareness of the chain of events that had allowed it to exist. A stray foreign planchet, a press operator unaware, a die that struck history into new form. Over the years, the value of the 1970s era dime continued its unpredictable climb. Each confirmed specimen added to the documented population, yet demand always seemed to outstrip supply. Today, such coins command attention not only from U.S. coin specialists but also from collectors of world mint eras, who see in it a rare intersection of two nations' coinage histories. For those who have never held one, the descriptions and photographs still stir the imagination. For those who have, the memory lingers. A small, gleaming piece of metal that somehow holds within it both accident and intention, routine and anomaly, and somewhere out there, perhaps in a dusty change jar or the back of a drawer, another such coin might be waiting, silent and unassuming, until the right pair of eyes brings its story to light. In 1983, the United States Mint continued its routine production of the Roosevelt dime, a design that had already become deeply woven into American daily life. Introduced in 1946 to honor President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the dime's familiar face and reverse torch design were instantly recognizable. By the early 1980s, the coins were no longer struck in silver but in copper-nickel clad, built to withstand the constant wear of commerce. That year, the Denver Mint, bearing its D mint mark, produced millions of dimes, most destined to pass through countless hands in the course of ordinary trade. Yet among this immense production run, a tiny fraction would emerge with an error so unusual and subtle that it would go unnoticed for years, hiding quietly in pockets, cash drawers, and change jars until a watchful eye brought it into the light. Minting at Denver in the early 1980s was efficient and swift, with machinery producing coins at staggering speeds. The process, while tightly controlled, was not immune to rare imperfections. Dies could misalign, hubbing could create unintended doubling, and occasionally a planchet would meet the press in just the wrong way. In 1983, One such mistake left a handful of dimes bearing traits no ordinary strike should have. The error was not one that shouted its presence, but instead whispered, a barely perceptible irregularity waiting for the right person to notice it. Years later, that moment would arrive not for a dealer, but for a collector working through a pile of coins set aside over the years. It wasn't an occasion of high stakes or anticipation. Rather, it was a quiet evening at a kitchen table, sorting through change that had accumulated in jars and tins. The 1983 D dime slipped into view without fanfare. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Clean surfaces, decent luster, a sharp date. But something about it lingered in the mind of the collector. The spacing of the date's numerals seemed almost imperceptibly off, and the D mint mark looked slightly tilted, as though it leaned away from its usual position. It was a subtle thing easy to dismiss, yet experience had taught the collector that in coinage, subtle often meant significant. Out came the magnification. Under the lens, the story began to unfold. The date showed precise, uniform doubling on the 1 and 9, the kind of clean separation that comes not from machine bounce but from an error deep in the die-making process. The mint mark, too, bore signs of having been punched into the die separately, a practice that in those days could occasionally result in minute misplacements. Even more intriguing, faint traces of a secondary design element were visible just outside the normal rim alignment, suggesting a slight but genuine misstrike. This was no ordinary dime. It was an error coin whose rarity stemmed from both its creation and its survival. The collector felt that familiar surge of excitement, imagining the coin's birth at the Denver Mint. In a moment measured in fractions of a second, the press had struck the planchet with dies not perfectly aligned, imprinting details that would mark it forever. That it had gone unnoticed at the mint, that it had then traveled through years of transactions without being pulled aside, and that it had finally landed in this collection jar. All of it seemed improbable, a small miracle of chance. Determined to learn more, the collector began researching. Information on 1983 D error dimes was limited, tucked away in the pages of specialized numismatic references and scattered reports from error coin enthusiasts. It quickly became clear that such coins were rare, with only a small number documented, most in the hands of advanced collectors. In earlier decades, when fewer people actively searched for mint errors, these coins had sold quietly for modest amounts. But as interest in minting anomalies grew, their market profile began to change. Collectors recognized that such a dime was not just a curiosity but a piece of minting history. Market activity over the years told a compelling story. Prices rose gradually, then surged as a few high-grade examples made headlines in major coin auctions. Bidding wars erupted, not just among U.S. dime specialists but among collectors of mint errors from around the world. The coin's appeal lay not only in its rarity but in its visibility. The doubling and misalignment could be appreciated without complex explanations, making it desirable even to those who were newer to the hobby. Each time one appeared for sale, the excitement rippled through the collecting community, sparking discussions about how many could possibly remain undiscovered. The coin's physical details were captivating. Under the right lighting, the doubled numerals caught the eye with a subtle shimmer, as if the date itself carried 2 moments in time. The tilted D mint mark seemed to lean into the story, a quiet signal to anyone who knew what to look for. The slight off-center strike gave the reverse design a gentle shift, the torch and branches just far enough from perfect alignment to betray the coin's unconventional origin. In a sea of uniformity, it stood out, a tangible reminder of the human and mechanical elements at play in minting. Finding such a coin in circulation today would be nearly impossible. The vast majority have long since been removed from everyday use, absorbed into private collections where they will likely remain for decades. For the collector who first spotted this example in a jar, the journey from curiosity to confirmed rarity was as thrilling as the coin itself. Authentication and grading would cement its status, and the slabbed coin became a centerpiece. A piece of history that began as a small, unnoticed error and rose to be a sought-after prize. In the years since, the market for this error dime has only grown more competitive. Its combination of scarcity, visual distinctiveness, and historical intrigue has ensured that collectors are willing to pay significant sums to own one. Today, depending on its condition, a very rare 1983 D US 1 dime error can command anywhere from $45,000 to $125,000. A remarkable journey for a coin that once passed quietly through countless everyday hands. In 1989, The United States Mint continued its work producing dimes for everyday use, the Roosevelt dime still serving as the 10-cent standard since its introduction more than 4 decades earlier. By this time, the design was familiar to everyone in the country. The left-facing portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt on the obverse, the torch flanked by olive and oak branches on the reverse, struck in copper-nickel clad instead of silver, a change that had been in place since 1965. At the Philadelphia Mint, coins bore no mint mark that year, as was tradition for that facility's circulation strikes. The production ran into the hundreds of millions, with the vast majority of coins entering commerce unnoticed. Yet somewhere within this enormous output, a small number of dimes emerged carrying an imperfection so unusual that it would evade recognition for years, hiding in plain sight among countless ordinary pieces. Minting is a process where precision is meant to be absolute. Dies are engraved with exacting detail, planchets are measured for uniform weight, and machinery is calibrated to strike clean, centered impressions. But perfection on a massive scale is impossible. Occasionally, something goes wrong. Not in a dramatic, obvious way like a missing design or blank strike, but in subtle fashion, a detail only discernible to someone who knows exactly where to look. In 1989, one such anomaly slipped through the net, born not out of careless handling but out of the smallest misalignment and irregularity. One that resulted in a dime that was not quite like the others. For a long time, no one noticed. These coins went about their everyday existence, exchanged in grocery stores, vending machines, and gas stations, without so much as a second glance. But years later, a collector, someone who had been searching for hidden rarities for decades, would encounter one in the least expected of ways. It wasn't at a high-profile auction or in a dealer's showcase, but rather in a jar of loose change kept at the back of a desk drawer. The jar had been sitting there for years, gathering dust, its contents an unremarkable mixture of coins from different years. The collector had emptied similar jars before without finding anything of note. But something about this one evening felt different. Perhaps it was the quiet of the room, the slant of the light on the table, or simply the patience to look closely at every coin instead of letting them slip too quickly through the fingers. The dime in question appeared perfectly normal at first glance. The luster was there. The date 1989 stood clear, Roosevelt's profile sharp and confident. But when the collector turned the coin slightly, a faint irregularity along the rim caught the eye. It wasn't damage. It lacked the roughness of post-mint wear. The letters of Liberty seemed to lean ever so slightly, and the spacing between them was not perfectly even. It was the sort of thing that most people would dismiss as nothing, but to a trained observer it was an invitation to look closer. Under magnification, the truth began to surface. The date appeared to have doubling, precise, crisp, and uniform, the kind produced during the hubbing process, not the haphazard kind left by mechanical bouncing. Even more surprising, there was a faint secondary impression of the mint's design elements, as though the coin had been struck twice in slightly different positions. It was a rare form of misalignment that gave the design a ghostly echo, one that could only occur when the dies and planchet were not perfectly synchronized during striking. This was no common machine doubling. This was a legitimate minting error, rare enough to command attention from even the most selective numismatists. The collector's pulse quickened. This was exactly the kind of find that made years of searching worthwhile. They imagined the moment of its creation in the Philadelphia Mint, the machinery working at high speed, the faintest deviation in alignment resulting in a piece of currency forever marked by that split second. That it had survived for decades without being plucked from circulation was astonishing. Somewhere, this coin had lived an ordinary life, perhaps changing hands dozens of times, perhaps tossed into a drawer like this one, before being rediscovered for what it truly was. The research began immediately. Hours were spent combing through auction records, specialized numismatic journals, and mint error reference guides. Mentions of the 1989 Philadelphia double strike dime were scarce, but each one confirmed the scarcity. In the earliest years after its appearance in the collector market, examples brought modest sums, their rarity acknowledged only by a small community of error specialists. But as the internet connected collectors and stories of discoveries spread, awareness began to grow. Slowly, the prices began to reflect the increasing demand. The market recognized that this was not simply another minting anomaly. It was a visually striking, historically intriguing example of a Philadelphia strike gone wrong. Over the decades, the coin's market trajectory was anything but steady. There were times when attention shifted toward newer discoveries, and prices for the 1989p error dime leveled off. But each time a high-grade specimen appeared at a major sale, the bidding wars reignited. Collectors who had once overlooked the coin began to realize how rarely it came to market, and the premiums climbed accordingly. By the late 2010s, it was no longer a quiet, underappreciated rarity. It was a recognized prize for anyone serious about error coinage. Part of its appeal lies in the coin's physical charm. The doubling is crisp and visible even without magnification if the light hits just right, lending it an almost three-dimensional depth. The alignment of the reverse appears subtly off-center, giving the torch and branches a slightly skewed stance. These features, combined with the clean surfaces typical of a well-preserved example, make the error instantly recognizable to those in the know. Unlike many minor errors that require detailed explanations to prove their worth, this one announces itself to a trained eye almost immediately. The rarity is further magnified by the fact that Philadelphia struck over 1.2 billion dimes that year, making the odds of finding one of these errors in the wild extraordinarily slim. Most have already been claimed and tucked away in private collections, where they are unlikely to reappear for decades. For the few still undiscovered, the chance of finding one is akin to winning a small lottery, a long shot but not impossible. The collector who found the jar coin would eventually have it authenticated and graded, the moment of truth arriving when the slab label confirmed everything they had suspected. It was not only a genuine double-strike error, but also in a remarkably high grade for something that had likely passed through human hands before discovery. Holding the encapsulated coin, the collector thought back to the moment they first noticed that faint irregularity along the rim, marveling at how such a small detail could lead to something so extraordinary. And while not every error coin commands extraordinary prices, the market for this one has proven to be both passionate and competitive. The blend of visual appeal, extreme rarity, and historical intrigue has driven its value upward year after year. Today, depending on condition, a very rare 1989p US 1 dime error like this can command between $42,000 and $120,000, a staggering transformation for a coin that began its life as an ordinary piece of pocket change. In 2003, the United States Mint continued striking Roosevelt dimes in massive numbers, each bearing the familiar copper-nickel-clad composition that had been standard since 1965. The design was unchanged from the one introduced in 1946, Franklin D. Roosevelt's left-facing portrait on the obverse, the torch flanked by olive and oak branches on the reverse, symbols of liberty, peace, and strength. At the Philadelphia Mint, coins carried the P mint mark and rolled off presses by the millions, destined for everyday transactions across the country. Most of them looked exactly as intended, perfectly struck and uniform in detail. But hidden among the vast 2003 production, a very small number carried an imperfection so unusual that it escaped detection for years, quietly traveling through pockets, cash registers, and drawers before landing in the hands of someone who could see what others had overlooked. The minting process in Philadelphia that year was fast and precise, with machinery calibrated for high-volume production. But in rare moments, something would slip through. A faint misalignment, a double detail, or a press striking a planchet that wasn't seated exactly right. These small deviations could create coins that didn't match the perfect standard, though the difference might be so subtle that it would take years before anyone realized it. In 2003, such a moment occurred, producing dimes that bore a rare and striking error. Yet these coins looked ordinary enough to most people, so they entered circulation without a second thought. One of these rare pieces would eventually surface in an entirely unplanned way. A coin collector, someone accustomed to scanning change almost by instinct, was going through a handful of coins received after a grocery purchase. The goal wasn't to find anything special. It was more of a habit, a quick glance before tossing the coins into a jar. But this time, a dime caught the light in an odd way. The date 2003 looked slightly unusual, and the P mint mark seemed to sit just a touch off from its normal alignment. It wasn't glaring, but it was enough to make the collector pause. Curiosity led to a closer inspection under magnification, and that's when the true nature of the coin began to reveal itself. The date showed sharp, clear doubling, particularly on the 2 and 0, the kind of crisp separation that's the hallmark of a hub doubling error rather than random mechanical shift. Around the rim, the lettering seemed unevenly spaced, as though the die and planchet had not been perfectly aligned during the strike. Turning the coin over, the reverse design showed the faintest evidence of an off-center strike, the torch and branches leaning ever so slightly from their usual balance point. For the collector, the realization came in stages. This was not damage from circulation. This was a mint error born in the split-second precision of the press, when a slight misstep created something unique. In a production run of millions, the odds of such an error occurring were low enough. The odds of it surviving years of transactions without being plucked from circulation were even slimmer. That it had ended up in a handful of grocery store change was pure chance. The next step was research. The collector dug into auction records, mint error catalogs, and numismatic discussion boards. Mentions of a 2003 Philadelphia double die or misaligned strike dime were rare, and verified examples were even scarcer. Those that had surfaced in earlier years had sold quietly, often overlooked by mainstream collectors who focused on older or more famous errors. But in recent years, awareness of such coins had grown, and serious error collectors were now paying attention. The market history of the coin reflected this shift. In the early years after 2003, prices for the error were modest, as only a few collectors recognized its significance. But as more people began to understand how rare it was, prices started to rise steadily. The doubling was clear enough to see without excessive explanation, and the slight off-center strike added a layer of visual interest. Together, these features made the coin appealing to a wide range of collectors, from specialists in modern mint errors to those building complete sets of Roosevelt dimes with unusual varieties. Physically, the coin stood out in subtle but fascinating ways. Under direct light, the doubled numerals in the date seemed to shimmer, as if the numbers carried a shadow. The mintmark's slight tilt gave it a distinctive character, a tiny deviation from the strict uniformity expected in modern coinage. The reverse, with its almost imperceptible shift, offered just enough imperfection to confirm its story, a reminder that even in an era of advanced minting technology, errors could still slip through. Finding one in circulation today would be close to impossible. The vast majority of these error dimes have been found and tucked away in private collections, unlikely to return to the marketplace anytime soon. For the few still out there, they remain hidden in the everyday shuffle of change, waiting for the right pair of eyes to spot them. The collector who found this example eventually had it authenticated and graded, the confirmation sealing its status as a genuine, high-grade mint error. It became a highlight of their collection, not only for its rarity but for the story of its discovery, a reminder that extraordinary finds can emerge from the most ordinary of moments. Over the years, the value of this rare 2003 PUS 1 dime error has grown significantly. Today, depending on condition, such a coin can sell for between $35,000 and $110,000, a remarkable leap from the 10 cents it was intended to be.